Gemar Khatma Tova, everyone, and welcome to this year's HGSS Shabbat Shuvah Drasha. Now, it's a little different, of course. The live Shabbat Shuvah Drasha will take place on Shabbos after Mincha, so Mincha 6:45, followed by the Shabbat Shuvah Drasha. But for those who cannot be there live, we are doing a broadcast over Facebook Live this evening and YouTube Live. So tonight we're going to be talking about Rabbi Sacks's morality. Now, it's the latest book that he's written, and we're going to look at Teshuvah insights from Rabbi Sacks's book. There are source sheets for tonight's shiur, and I've posted a link to the source sheets in a previous post. So please do check on the Facebook page, on the HGSS Facebook page, for the link to our sources. So I'd like to begin with a recent interview that Rabbi Sacks did with JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. The book was only released a couple of weeks ago in the US and the United States, and he was interviewed by JTA. And one of the things he commented on was the upcoming US elections. Rabbi Shmuel Kamenetsky, the Rosh Yeshiva of Philadelphia, and a prominent American posek, American rabbi, had announced to his flock, which number in the hundreds of thousands of people, that they should vote for President Trump as a hakara satov, and mark of appreciation for what he has done for Israel. And Rabbi Sacks was asked about Rabbi Kamenetsky's declaration, and he commented as follows. He said, "It's a big, big mistake to mix politics and religion. You mix religion and politics, you get terrible politics and even worse religion." He then said, "I'm afraid I have absolutely not the slightest shred of sympathy for anyone who, as a rabbi, tells people how to vote." Now, this notion of not mixing religion and politics is an ancient idea. It's often given the notion from it's a New Testament notion. It's a notion of render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and then to God the things that are God's. And of course, that was the way that Jesus described that one should still adhere to the law and pay one's taxes. But it's become a symbol for the separation in some people's minds between church and state. So rendering to Caesar that which is Caesar's, and to God that which is God's, and religion and politics should not mix. That notwithstanding, there is a very strong tradition, particularly in America, of viewing the clergy as the moral standard bearers of the nation, and that clergy members are expected to have some kind of political position. And I want to, as we get later into this year, examine why that might be the case. But in terms of commentary on what Rabbi Sacks has said, our own Melanie Phillips had commented that there are times that it would make sense to mix in politically, and that would be when it affects us directly. So certainly in the most recent British elections, December 14th, 2019, Chief Rabbi Mervis, I think the whole community stood behind him, or vast majority of the community stood behind him when he said that Corbyn would be a bad idea because it would affect our personal physical security, cultural security as a community. And for that reason, Melanie Phillips says in those cases, that would definitely be an exception. But as I say, there is an American tradition that whether it's something that affects us personally or generally, clergy are looked to as that moral voice. Certainly, before we came here, I wanted to be a little better versed in British culture. And I read the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby's book, and there was no doubt that while he's not endorsing a particular party, it was a very strong political statement. And even if you look, oftentimes we hear about the Judeo-Christian tradition. Now, the Judeo-Christian tradition has many meanings. It's something that dates back to the early 20th century debates in America as to what it meant. But according to the social gospel, which was a movement amongst many mainline Protestant churches, the Judeo-Christian tradition is hearkening back to the time of the ancient Israelite prophets, who in the Old Testament time, who would exhort the political rulers. And as Rabbi Sachs says, is fair game to be able to speak truth to power. And so there is this notion that clergy should be involved to some extent. And so I'd like to explore that, unpack that a little later in tonight's share. But let's begin with some of his key themes in morality and how they, from a perspective, from a text perspective, what can we do and learn and derive for our Teshuvah at this time of year? So let's open up our source sheets, and I'm going to look at a few key themes. The first theme for this evening is the theme of open conversation. Rabbi Sachs decries the lack of open communication, open conversation that's taking place nowadays. He says there's a loss of openness on university campuses. University campuses are now this safe space where they don't want to offend anybody. And so what happens is there's a certain line of thinking that becomes the standard way of thinking, and anybody else that's debating that or not towing the party line is accused of bigotry, racism, homophobia, all kinds of appellations that, free speech theoretically means as long as there's no incitement to violence. But to be able to debate certain ideas, of late, over the last few years, there's been a sense where certain opinions, ideas have been silenced. And Rabbi Sachs is very unhappy about that. He says that it's very important that, from our perspective, that we listen to all sides, then that we listen and understand other people's perspectives. That's the only way that we can grow philosophically and grow as a society. He quotes Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, who says like this. He says, "In great contests, each party claims to act in accordance with the will of God. Both may be and one must be wrong." Let me repeat that. Both may be and one must be wrong. God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time. Rabbi Sachs says from here, we see that Abraham Lincoln concluded, this was in some personal notes, that one has to be humble and one cannot demonize one's opponents, even if you believe that you're right, because they also believe that they're right. They believe that they're also acting in the highest levels of altruism, righteousness, as messengers of God. And so while you both cannot be right, somebody must be wrong. Maybe you're both wrong. So yes, there has to be debate, but it can't come with the demonization of one's opponents. So the key message from Rabbi Sachs is that we have to listen. We have to listen to what others have to say, and only once we listen and we appreciate and understand, then we can formulate opinions and arrive at the truth. So let's look at our source sheets. And the first one we have is in Pirkei Avot, chapter 2. Rabbi Elazar says, "Have a shakot lilmod Torah." One should be dedicated to learning Torah. V'da masha tashiv la'apikaros, and know how to respond to a heretic. V'da lifnei mi ata amel, and know before whom you are toiling for the Almighty. V'ne'eman hu b'malachtecha she'ishal nechasecha pulasecha, and know that your employer is trustworthy, that he will compensate you for your work. So what's going on in this Mishnah? the key phrase that stands out in this Mishnah in terms of our conversation is "Da mashitash l'apikoros." Know what to answer to a heretic. So the Mishnah says our tradition is that we don't say, well, I'm just simply going to be dismissive of you. I don't agree with your opinions, and so let me just ignore you, and you are wrong, and you are evil. No, I'm going to sit down with you, sit at the table, and know how to articulate my opinions, my thoughts, my feelings, my sentiments well enough to be able to at least have a conversation with you. And the only way to be able to respond is if I truly understand where you're coming from. And in order to be able to do that, one almost has to be able to articulate in the words of the other person what their opinion is, and then to be able to demonstrate logically why I believe that is incorrect. But let's look at the other clauses in the Mishnah which clue us into how to make that happen. The first one is you have to be dedicated to Torah learning, or whatever learning it is. Nowadays, with social media and the pace of technology, many of us are just used to sound bites. And so we can't really debate the other side because we just know the sound bite of the party line that we've chosen to adhere to. But shakud means I need to really get deep into it. I need to be really confident and understand my position in order to be able to debate you on your position. If I don't really understand the position of the side that I've taken, then how can I question you? How can I demonize you? So the step number one is I have to well and truly understand the position I've taken, delved into it, and not simply just adopted a party line because that's what everybody else is doing. Then afterwards, know before whom you are toiling. Sometimes we can get involved in debate, and if one isn't so strong, you could be led astray. So you always have to know, what's my mission, what's my starting point, and can I continue to defend that mission that I have as a Jew, as a person who's committed to this heritage. And even if it seems that the other side might be winning, know that the Almighty has a long-term look at things and is trustworthy. Right? So hold the line, commit to that constant debate, but being strong in your own position, and the Almighty will make sure that He carries you through. Second thing we have is the Gemara in Eruvin 13b. Says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Abba Mashmul, for 3 years, the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel were divided on halachic debates. Each one said the halacha is like us. Then a heavenly voice came forth and said, no, you're both right. Nevertheless, practically speaking, the halacha is like the house of Hillel. If both are right, so for what merit did the house of Hillel have that the halacha was decided in accordance with them? Because they were very calm and pleasant and accepting. When they would teach, they would say, well, this is our opinion, this is the opinion of the house of Shammai. Furthermore, they would actually present the other opinion first before their own. Right? Here we have a confidence. Beis Hillel says, we're not going to hide from the other opinion. We're going to be able to articulate that if we are confident in the correctness of our view, we have to be able to demonstrate what the other view is and why we feel that that's not the view that we're taking. And because of that, heaven decided that they should be the binding halacha. Now, it's interesting to know, I bring in the Malbim here, you can see in the middle of the paragraph, it's a line that begins, Inyana ba'olam hagufim. So it says, V'sheken yipasko halacha la'asad lavoi, that in the future, when Mashiach comes, the halacha will be like the house of Shammai. So everybody thinks, well, everything's going to flip. Why would that be? So he explains it from a certain perspective, but I want to suggest it's not that the halacha would be like the house of Shammai completely and utterly when Mashiach comes. Rather, when Mashiach comes and Mala Hashem will understand the truth, will know who was right in which scenario, in which case. It won't be a blanket rule that it's always like Beis Hillel. It will be many times like Beis Shammai. But for the moment, because they were such peacemakers, the halacha is like Beis Hillel. If we go over the page, we see in Baba Basra, Yosef Red Rabbi Yosef Chalash, he took ill in Gid and fainted. Amalei Avua, my chazis. So when he recovered, his father said to him, "What did you see in your near-death experience?" Amalei said to him, I saw an upside-down world in heaven. People who were important and now below, and people who were less important and now above. No, you didn't see an upside-down world. You saw the clear world, the way things are in reality, because this world is an alma de shikra, a world of falsehood. And so only once we accept that, that's really Abraham Lincoln's notion here, that we both might be wrong. One must be wrong, but we both might be wrong. And that's the assumption that we have to have going into any discussion, debate, conversation, that maybe I'm not right. Maybe I have to listen to you because maybe I can be convinced of the way that you look at things. But the only way that I can do that is if I'm willing to have that humility, to have that conversation and truly understand what it is that you are opining. Now, in terms of our personal relationships, let's talk Teshuvah for this week of Shabbat Shuvah. Even in our own, it doesn't have to be major world debates, major right-left debates. Even our own personal relationships, relationships with our spouses, with our children, with our parents, our siblings, our colleagues, our friends, our neighbors. What I often advise people is when you sit down at the table, ask the other person what their issue is, problem is, and before you even start to discuss it, articulate it. Say to them, so as far as I understand, this is what you're saying is the issue. And they might say, no, that's not what I said. So you ask, okay, so tell me again what you said, and then you try to re-articulate it, right? This works for couples. And it's only once, first things first is to hear, listen, and understand and articulate, and then be able to think, okay, so if that's what they're saying, why do I believe differently? Why have I seen things from a different perspective? And when we do that, then we can come to some kind of resolution, reconciliation, agreement, or at least an agreement to disagree, now that we at least understand where the other person's coming from. So that's our Shuvah lesson from the first part. Second idea Rabbi Sachs deals with is victimhood. Writes Rabbi Sachs, in the liberal state, there is a great difference between a future-oriented politics and one that focuses on grievances of the past, between a culture that emphasizes responsibility and one constructed around an ever-expanding notion of rights, between one that defines people as victims and one that helps genuine victims to recover their capacity for action and self-determination. He continues in another section of the book, decrying the rise of what he calls unsocial media, because on social media it's all about me. It's about my selfies and my Instagram and my Facebook and how many likes I'm going to get. And there's no real interaction and relationship because there's no physical interaction, and so there's no nuance. In a further section of the book, he talks about public shaming. I mean, we saw this recently with J.K. Rowling and others, that suddenly they could be cancelled and all bets are off, and suddenly everything that they've ever said or done is wrong, and they as a person are wrong, and they can never do teshuvah for that. They can never repent. They can never say, well, even if they did change their mind about a certain view. No, in cancel culture, that's it. It's all bets are off. It's over. So what does Judaism say about this victimhood culture? So let's look in Bamidbar 12:3. Moses was the most humble person upon the face of the earth. Says the Haktava Kabbalah. Moshe knew who he was. I mean, he was humble. So how could he be humble? I mean, he knew he spoke to God. He knew he was the father of all sages and prophets. Nevertheless, anybody that he interacted with who was lower than him in status, which was everybody, was so dear to him, so important to him in his eyes. Have his zichron zikulos malosim flosim neged ene libo behita einov l'tovus calls lost. He removed all self-worth from the forefront of his mind and started focusing on this other person and said, what can I do to make this other person's life better, happier, more fulfilled, more prosperous? Everybody else was more important to him than himself. To the extent, how did we know this? Well, he was willing to say, erase me from the book that you've written from the Torah in order that they should be saved, the Israelites, after the sin of the golden calf. So what's another? What's humility? Humility is saying, okay, as great as I might be, I'm still not the most important person here. The other person is just as important, if not more important. I happen to have a certain skill set. God has blessed me, God has endowed me, and now I have even greater responsibility to serve the other person. In other words, what are we saying here? In Judaism, it's about the contribution that I can make, not the rights, my privileges, what I deserve. That's what victim culture is about. My rights, what's in it for me? Social media, what my likes. No, that's not what Judaism. Judaism says that the entire purpose in this world is what can I contribute, no matter my station in life. No matter if I'm a Moshe Rabbeinu or I'm somewhere at the other end of the spectrum in terms of gifts and bounty from heaven, I have to always look out for the other person, not for myself. If I'm looking out for the other person, that's how I lead a fulfilled life. Says the Gemara in Shabbos 88b, Tan Rabbanan, Aluvin Beinan Elvin. One should be of the insulted and those who do not insult. Shomin Cherpasim and Meshivin, those who hear their shame and do not respond. Osim Ava, who act out of joy, or Smechem Bisurin, and are happy with suffering. Aleina Kosovema, concerning those people, the verse says, and those that love God are like the sun that goes forth in its might. Says Rashi, why would who's getting excited and full of joy? Those people who are being insulted. Now the Chafetz Chaim says that why would you be excited for being insulted? Answer is because when people insult you spiritually, they draw from you any negative energy and it goes onto them. And so it's great. Somebody insults me, somebody makes fun of me, somebody mocks me, somebody does something bad to me. It's any negative energy, any punishment, any issues is now upon them. So that's something to be excited about. So I don't feel like a victim. If somebody is treating me poorly, I feel like a victor. I feel wonderful. This is great. Okay. I can handle this. This is a challenge that's come from God, and I am going to continue to contribute, and I'm going to continue to make them feel awesome, despite the fact of however they're making me feel. So that's our next Teshuvah idea. How much can I contribute given the hand of cards that I've been dealt, and how much can I make other people feel awesome, despite however they're trying to lower me? All right, next idea, and this is probably the primary idea of his book Morality. It's what he calls covenantal thinking. So Rabbi Sachs says that we need to move from I to we. And he does this in a number of his works, he contrasts the idea of a contract versus a covenant as follows. Contracts invite us to think about what we gain. Covenants ask us to think about the impact we have on others. In the case of business, like you would think in business that it's only about my personal gain, right? Adam Smith, the wealth of nations. If everybody's looking out for themselves, then the tide will rise for all. No, listen to what Rabbi Sachs says. In the case of business, this means not only shareholders and employees, but also the wider society. Every decision that I make, I have to ask myself, what's the impact on the wider society, on the world? You think about things like environmental impacts that I'm making as a business. It's not just about me. That's the way I deal with covenantal thinking. It's not about I, it's about we. So let's look into our sources for covenantal thinking. The first one we have is the Gemara in Shuvah on top of page 3. So the pasuk says in Leviticus, in Vayikra, and they shall stumble upon one another. So the Gemara says that means ish ba'avon achiv, that we'll stumble on account of the sin of somebody else. What does that mean? Which comes to teach us that all Israel are guarantors for one another. If somebody else is sinning, then I'm also stumbling. I have an obligation, I have a duty, responsibility to be able to make sure that they are also not sinning. It's not just about me, it's about all of Israel. Says the Ritva, a medieval commentator on the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah 29a, even though mitzvahs are incumbent upon each individual, we are all responsible guarantors for one another. We're all like one body. And it's like a guarantor who's having to pay back the loan for his friend that's defaulting. That's your responsibility. You are a guarantor for your friend. So if they can't pay, you have to somehow make amends and you have to be able to help them. Says the Gemara in Sota 37b. Actually, before we get there, so I'm familiar with this idea of Kol Yisrael Arevim, and I assumed that this is the notion of a covenantal community. So just once again to recap Rabbi Sachs's thesis in his book Morality. He says that what we have done is we have delegated too much of our societal responsibility to the state. Right? We expect the state to take care of the welfare of people. Instead of, it used to be back in the day, there were communities and civil society and groups, religious groups and civic groups that would look out for the welfare of one another. But nowadays we just expect the state to take care of it or individuals, and nobody's looking out for anybody else. You're not looking out for your neighbors and anybody else in society. But if we went back to this covenantal community where we're not just contractually related to one another, but covenantally related to one another, then everybody would benefit because we're looking out for one another's welfare. But here's the problem. I understand that we have a concept of covenant, bris, between us and God. And God made a covenant between himself and humankind after the flood. God made a covenant with the Jewish people, beginning with Abraham and then later with Moshe and the children of Israel. But where do we have a concept where we make a covenant with other people? So the closest idea that I think we have, although Rabbi Sachs doesn't refer to this explicitly, is this notion of Kol Yisrael Arevim Ze Lezeh. We are all responsible for one another. Now, the problem with Kol Yisrael Arevim Ze Lezeh, at least in the first idea, V'kashtu ish ba'achiv, that we will stumble over one another, is that it would appear that it's an imposed responsibility from above. I didn't choose to be responsible for my fellow Jew. God told me that you're on the same team, you're all one body, and so you're responsible. You're not just running this race alone. And so you're responsible for your friends' actions as well. You need to make sure that they're also keeping up. But if I didn't make that commitment, how's that a covenantal community? That's a relationship, a vertical relationship, a vertical commitment that I made with God, not a horizontal commitment that I made to anybody else. It's something that God imposed on me, that this is my team and this is who I have to work with. So I posed this question to Rabbi Dr. Rafi Zarim at LSJS, and he was very quick to bring me to the Gemara in Sota. So thank you, Rabbi Zarim. So the Gemara in Sota, 37b, says as follows: Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Ishkvar Akko Amar Mishum Rabbi Shimon. Ein lecha mitzvah sheksuv b'Torah. There is not a single mitzvah that is written in the Torah. Shalei nichraso aleh arba'im u'shmona brisos shel sheish me'es elef v'shleishes alfim v'chamesh me'es v'chamishim. Every single mitzvah, there were 48 covenants that were established of 603,550 times. So what are we talking about here? Says Rashi, every Israelite that was in the desert made a commitment, a covenant, corresponding to every single other Israelite that was present in the wilderness. What does that mean? We made a covenant, and when did we make this covenant with every other Israelite in the wilderness? Says the Tosfos. I'm going to just take this idea very quickly. Remember, we stand at Mount Avel and Mount Gerizim, and a number of blessings are recited, a number of curses are recited. And one of those is, cursed be the man that does not sustain, does not hold up this Torah. And the entire nation answered, Amen. Says Tosfos, at that point, we all committed to sustain the Torah. Not just my own Torah, but to keep the Torah going for the whole nation. That if somebody else is a little lax, that I'm going to help raise them up. So when I said Amen, I made a commitment, I made a covenantal community amongst all of Israel, the consequence of which is Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh. I'm now responsible. I'm now a guarantor. I've taken it upon myself. This wasn't imposed from above. This was something that I voluntarily, as a Jew, as an Israelite, committed to this covenantal community amongst our people. And so what Rabbi Sachs is asking of us is that we, as a British nation, he talks about as an American nation, that we have a similar covenantal community, that we're not just looking to beat the next guy. It's not competition. This is all our nation working together. We have to take it upon ourselves that we want the best for everybody out there. And if there's some way that we can bring light and joy and success to the next person, I should be striving for that. I shouldn't just say, well, the state can take care of them. I should be seeing how can I help other people in their efforts as well. And finally, another idea in the covenantal thinking, bottom page 3, Rabbi Savar Nicholay Lechaved Levid, who is Surah Kalila Levid Amaretz Surah Rabbah. The Gemara talks about tithing. Now, ideally, tithes should be taken from the crop that is in front of you. Some people do that all the time, and some people kind of use different crops and say, well, I'm using the crop that I had last week, I doubled up then, which is not the right way to do things. But the Gemara has an idea. And the Gemara says that sometimes, even if we're using not the ideal way of tithing, but it means that I can be doing things in such a way that the entire tide rises for everyone, because now the person who is not so strict about tithing will only eat tithe produce, then I will use, as a learned person, I will use a weaker means of doing things in order that they shouldn't sin. And so Rabbi Yikasil Yehuda Halberstam, the Sankt Kloisenberger Rebbe, great Rebbe, he survived the Holocaust. He was married with 11 children prior to the Holocaust. He lost everybody. After the Holocaust, he remarried, had another 7 children. He moved to Netanya and he began the Lanyado Hospital. So he says that you have to understand what's the meaning behind this Gemara. What the Gemara is telling us is God has a plan. God has great nachas when mitzvahs are performed. So if you know that your teammate is struggling with their mitzvahs, it might mean that you have to compromise or sacrifice your performance of mitzvahs in order to build them up. I mean, I guess the classic idea of this is when I say, well, I'm going to stop a mitzvah that I'm doing, maybe I'm learning Torah, to be able to do a good deed for somebody else. Right? I'm not completely focused on my spirituality and using the time to help somebody else. Why? Is it my race or is it their race? No, says the Gemara, it's everybody's race. We're all on the same team, and therefore we all have to get to a better place, and that's what causes God joy. And so this is our next message of morality for Teshuvah for this week, is that it's not just about you. You have to look around you and hope that you're able to assist others in their spiritual growth as well, even if it means that your spiritual growth is slowed a little while you're helping others in their spiritual growth. And finally, we have an idea of identity. Says Rabbi Sachs, and we're going to run through this very quickly. He says society cannot exist and will fall unless it is bound together by common ideas. He says nations used to be held together by a single dominant religion and shared culture. That's not the case today. In part, it's because of the abandonment in the name of multiculturalism of the idea of a national culture into which newcomers like my father and grandparents, who were all immigrants in Britain, were expected to integrate. We can no longer build national identity on religion or ethnicity or culture, but we can build it on covenant. A covenantal politics would emphasize our responsibility to one another. Covenantal politics is about we the people, bound by a sense of shared belonging and collective responsibility. Now, here's what's important. Those who are familiar with Nathan Sharansky's work defending identity will know that identity and culture is based on having a strong identity to begin with, and then using that identity to be able to build on a mission beyond. So we're familiar with the concept of Or Lagoyim, that we are to be a light unto the nations. It says Isaiah, top of page 4, Ani Hashem krosicha v'tzedek v'achzek b'yodecha v'etzarcha v'etencha v'ris'am la'or goyim. I am Hashem in righteousness, I've summoned you, and I've grasped you by the hand, I created you and appointed you a covenant people, a light unto the nations. In 49:60 says, and he said, it's too light a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the offspring of Israel. I have made you a light unto the nations, and my salvation be unto the end of the earth. What's important here is before we can be a light unto the nations, first of all, we have to be strong in our own identity, who we are as a people. First, he makes the tribes of Israel strong, and then they become a light unto the nations. And in fact, if you continue into the Radak, you will see that this notion of if we are strong as a Jewish people, it's only when we're strong as a Jewish people that we can affect and impact and influence the world. But first of all, we need our strong identity before we can do that. Now, certainly this is something that Rabbi Sachs is alluding to when he says that we need our identity. Now, our identity of late, in many circles, identity, culture, nationalism, has become almost a dirty word. Just this week, Labour opposition leader Sir Keir Starmer has said he wants to bring back the working class by committing to patriotism. Because there are those that are saying, oh, we rather just be global citizens because we're ashamed of our British past. No, unless we're strong on who we are and the message that we can bring to the world. There are times that we've made mistakes, but we're willing to move forward, and we're willing to recognize that we have something to offer the world, that we are, Rabbi Sachs talks about a day of British values. But it's important that we know who we are in order to be able to take that as a message beyond. Now, returning to the original question that I posed, Rabbi Sachs saying we shouldn't mix into politics. Now, it's certainly true that what Rabbi Sachs is saying, that by towing a certain party line, if the other party gets in, then I'm excluded from the conversation. And I think it's true that Rabbi Sachs, for his part, has become a public intellectual whose ideas are listened to across the political spectrum. But nonetheless, what's important here is to know that culture is always contested. Cultural studies look at things like ethno-symbolism and different parties that are vying for what's our national story. And they look back and say, well, this point was our true national point. That's when we shone. But of course, national culture has always been changing, and things may go back decades, centuries, millennia, but the story is always changing, and that narrative is always being contested and competed for. But what's important, either way that we look at it, is to know that there must be a national narrative. What Rabbi Sachs is saying is that we need to have an identity, a value system to be able to instill in our children and in ourselves. And once we have that, then we know what our message is. And it's that message and values that we can be a shining example for the world. So that's true of us both as British citizens and as Jews. I can only be strong as a Jew and give a message of Jewish values to the world, a message of Tikkun Olam, if I'm strong in who I am as a Jew. I need to make sure that my family is strong. How do we become strong? Of course, that's Torah and mitzvot. Once I've established myself, and I'm going to read this Radak now that I mentioned briefly a moment ago. It says the Radak at the bottom of page 4, to sustain the existence of all the nations, because through you the world is continuing to exist. The idea of a covenant is a pact that sustains an existence, and so the Brit itself will be a light unto the nations, like it says, the nations will go by your light. The light is the Torah that goes out of Zion. Israel will sustain the nations of the world through two ways. One is that there will be peace amongst all the nations because of the Jewish people. Referring to the Messiah, it says he will speak words of peace to the nations, and he will rebuke many nations, and their swords will be beaten into plowshares. The second reason is that because of the Jewish people, the other nations will keep the seven Noahide laws, and they will go in a good path, like it says, and he will teach us his ways, and we shall walk in his paths. What's important, we have a code. Our moral code is the Torah with the 613 commandments. Only once we are strong in who we are, our identity, are we able to be a shining light into the nations and be able to know this is my identity and this is my mission, to be able to spread morality, monotheism, goodness, ethical living throughout the world. But first and foremost, I need to know who I am. And so we have to have strong values that we instill in our children. We have to let them know that the source of their morality is Torah and mitzvot. And when we do that, we will produce strong Jews, strong Jewish children, strong Jewish grandchildren who, please God, will not only care about themselves, part of their mission, part of their ideal of who they are in life will be, I'm strong as a Jew, and that mission is, here's my Torah mitzvot, and here's how I make the world a better place. Here's how I can contribute, because I know that it's not about me, it's about how much I can make this world a better place, a place better than the world I entered. So wishing you all Gemar Chatima Tova. May you be sealed for a year of blessing, prosperity, good health, above all, financial, academic success, and may we finally see the light at the end of all this darkness, but may we be the ones to lead in sharing that light by first and foremost, by being strong in who we are as proud Jews, Jews committed to our heritage, to Torah and mitzvot. Wishing everybody Shana Tova.